everybody. So I just wanted to make sure, based on last week's pod, it was absolutely clear. I care about human rights. Many of you know my origin story, but for those of you that don't, I was born in a country that's no stranger to civil war and religious and political persecution. Growing up, my family and I felt those effects. It affected our safety. It's in part what led my family to file for refugee status and stay in Canada. So this is a real part of my lived experience. That said, I realize that what I said last week lacked empathy, particularly towards others who are dealing with persecution, in this case, the Uyghurs. And based on what I read this week, I think what's happening to them in Western China is a terrible situation. I also want to talk about this idea about nobody caring. Look, if we take a step back and replace Uyghur with other really important issues, like the conflict in Yemen, a potential war in the Ukraine, gun control, school shootings, healthcare equity, we're faced with horrible events every day. However, the unfortunate state of the world today is that we've also normalized this routine of being confronted with something tragic or horrible or unjust and being allowed to react with thoughts and prayers. And this was the real intent of what I was trying to get across. So when I talk about my line, it's not about whether something matters or not. It's about which issues, of all the important issues we face every day, where I have the expertise and I believe I have the ability to have a real impact, even if just by a little. For me, those areas happen to be climate change, life sciences, and deep tech. But just because this is where I spend my time, it's not to take away from any of the real work any of you are doing in other areas. And then lastly, I just wanted to explain to people who may be new to the pod because of last week, that this is a place where four of us, four friends, talk about a whole wide range of things. We explore our curiosities, we try to learn from each other, we challenge each other, but we've always done it in a really supportive space. And I hope you keep that in mind as you listen and watch going forward. And hopefully you can bring some of that to your own conversations. That's all I have to say.
Well said.
Sax, I know you have something to say, but I'll say I got a lot of messages this past week after the show where, which I felt a little bit hurt by and mischaracterized, and maybe it was simply I said the wrong thing at the wrong time. And so I want to just be very clear about a couple of points, if I can take a minute. That's all right with you guys. Yeah, so I said, I just wanted to, I was going to actually send this out on Twitter, and I decided it was better just to address it on the pod. So to be clear, I strongly believe in and support absolute freedom of all people. And this means de facto, I strongly disagree with the suppression of free speech, denial of religious freedom, imprisonment, harm, capital punishment, slavery, and genocide. I thought this was obvious when we were having our conversation. I did not know.
So to be clear, you're
be...
not in favor of genocide.
I'm not in favor of genocide. Okay. I'm not in favor of slavery or capital punishment or suppression of religious freedom. I thought this was obvious. The conversation I tried to have was the wrong conversation at the wrong time, which was to try to talk about the broader China v. U.S. narrative that is swelling and will continue to swell this decade. I think that the primary function of civilized society or any advanced social system is to take care of and protect those that cannot take care of or protect themselves. And this is usually done by government. But when government fails and government is in fact the oppressor, I think it is the responsibility of other governments and other peoples to step in and have a voice and to take action. And so that is kind of my moral framework. I think it's important. I don't deny any of the harm being done to the Uyghur population in China. I don't agree with it on a principled basis. And I don't think that what the Chinese government is doing is right. And the point that I was trying to make during our conversation was a very different one that I think got completely lost in the moment, which was really just about what's going on with the China-US narrative right now. I'm not pro-China. I'm also not anti-China. I am particularly interested in understanding the broader China-US dynamic and what it means for the world over the coming decade and decades. I think it's really important for us when we evaluate these things and to understand them, to not just take sides, but to understand the context in the broadest way possible. And that's why I am trying to get both sides and understand the mindset of the peoples that are involved in running these governments and the way that this world is going to evolve as this economic tension continues to mount. And so that's where I was trying to go. And I was just trying to highlight where I think everything is headed over the next decade or two, independent of what are obvious human rights issues going on. So let me just stop there and say thanks for letting me say that. But that was important for me to just be really clear on, because clearly I wasn't clear last week. So
Well, and I'll just add to what you said that I also thought it was implied that you care about these things and that you're not in favor of them. I didn't think that need to be spoken.
yeah,
So I think it's nice that you're clarifying it, but I think any reasonable person would understand that if you care deeply as a vegan about factory farming, that you also care about humans and, genocide and torture or whatever issue. So I think it's like your statement is so obvious that I wonder if you even had to have made it, but I'm glad you did. Sachs?
Okay, so I guess first I should say that what's happening to the Uyghurs in China is indefensible. You've got reports of upwards of 1 million, of these people being held in detention camps. There's reports of mass sterilization and rape. It's like ethnic cleansing over there. So that's absolutely wrong, and it's one of a growing list of issues that we have serious problems with China on, which include theft of our intellectual property, cyber espionage, the bullying of their neighbors, their crackdown on dissidents. The list goes on and on. I mean, I think we have to be clear-eyed about the challenge and the threat that China represents, and we've discussed that on this pod many times. That being said, what I think we saw this week was really about cancel culture, right? You had, in response to last week's pod, you have this online mob form, and they want to take what Chamath said and interpret it in the worst possible light so they can turn the outrage meter up to 11. And everyone gets to basically go on Twitter and virtue signal and say what great people they are because Chamath is a bad person. And I just want to speak to that issue. I mean, there's a huge amount of hypocrisy going on in that, because how many of the people who are tweeting their outrage and their denunciation of Chamath are doing it from a device made by forced labor in China, wearing their Nikes made by forced labor in China, on their way to Target to buy cheap goods made in China? How many of those people have actually lifted a finger in the real world to help the Uyghurs? How many of them have sacrificed an economic benefit in any way? And so when Chamath said nobody cares, I thought it was a really startling statement by him. But if you define caring as doing something more than just virtue signaling and expressing your feelings, as actually making a sacrifice or taking a risk in the real world, I thought he was frankly telling us a very uncomfortable truth. We haven't really, most of us, done anything. And in that sense, I think the reason why his comments hit such a nerve, I don't think you get the kind of pile-on that we got unless he's saying something that's hitting a nerve. And I think the nerve, the thing that he exposed, is that we're not really doing more than virtue signaling on this issue. And then came all the hypocrites. You've got the NBA denouncing him, issuing a statement. What have they done? I mean, when Daryl Morey spoke up on behalf of the protesters in Hong Kong, the NBA shut down and sanctioned him. And, LeBron James said he was uneducated. Actually, I think Daryl Morey was pretty educated about what was going on. So you've got those hypocrites. You got the White House issuing a statement disavowing Chamath. But Hunter Biden went over to China to manage billions of dollars for them and profited by his business dealings over there. So there are a bunch of hypocrites. And the list goes on and on. And so, I think that in order for the mob to summon the outrage that it summons, it requires them to, I would say, first, put the worst possible light on what Chamath is saying and to ignore, I'd say, the fundamental truth of it. And second, to engage in this massive hypocrisy. And that is the way that cancel culture operates. And I don't think we should buy into it. So I appreciate what Chamath said. I think he's clarifying his remarks. He's showing that he does care and he does have empathy, as we all should. But I think there was a fundamental truth in what Chamath said last week. And that is what people are so uncomfortable with.
Okay, well said. I have feelings. And most of all, I'm thankful we had the discussion. The goal of this pod, I think what makes it special and why you all who are listening come here every week is because we're going to be honest with you and we're going to tackle these hard discussions. And I think Friedberg's comments and Sachs's comments really explain that and what our intent here is. And human rights is one of the hardest issues to discuss. That's why you don't hear it being discussed. And there are not easy answers. And I think, I was challenged by my besties on the episode, and their questions and their challenges were absolutely critical. Yes, how can we care about one group of people when the people in our backyard we're not caring about? Are we going to invade countries? These are very nuanced, difficult questions, but we must have this discussion. And if we try to cancel people with a 20-second clip that looks completely different, if you look at the 2-minute clip or you take the time to have a 40-minute listen of the whole segment, you get a totally different picture. And I think it's very important to raise awareness about human rights. And it is an issue that I have been passionate about my whole life. And I'm not trying to virtue signal or score any points here. But I know firsthand that raising awareness and having the discussions reduces the violations, because dictators, despots, and people doing this kind of stuff do not want the heat of what happened this past week. And what happened this past week is that more awareness was raised about the Uyghurs and the situation that they're going through, I think, than, as somebody who's monitored the situation, than I've seen in the last couple of years. Perhaps this was a tipping point, and that is something good that can come out of that discussion. Now, on a personal basis, I have had some feelings of guilt because it was very hard for me to watch what happened to Chamath this week and to watch people dunking on him. And then, let's face it, I brought the topic up and I dug in with my feelings, and it got a little heated, and I'm suddenly being portrayed as a hero in this discussion. That's not the intent. And there's no hero or villain in this. There is a hard discussion in this. And I am extremely proud of my friendship with each of you, especially you, Chamath. I am extremely proud of your candidness and tackling these issues and making people think about them. And, I'm just so proud to be friends with each of you. And I'm so proud of the work we do here every week. And I think it's important work. And I feel like I get smarter every week, and I hope the audience does too. And I hope we can keep having these discussions. Can
we now make fun of each other?
Yeah, now let's make fun of each other. I mean, I don't know if we're allowed to laugh. This is like so serious and heavy, but...
So what you're saying is thank you, Chamath.
Now that's going to be good for 20 seconds. I'm going to get canceled this week.
Jason of Arc.
Jason Calacanis.
Jason of Arc. But Sachs's point about, look, we've talked about cancel culture a lot on this show, and we've always been, I think, generally able to be third-party observers to what's happened. And it was really interesting to go through the cycle this week where, there was just kind of an echoing narrative on one thing that was said with one direction. There were a few pieces, though, Chamath, right? Wasn't there a piece from The Atlantic and some other pieces that kind of highlighted that things that you said were things that a lot of people won't say? And that's what was really so shocking for so many people.
What's the Peter Thiel comment on this whole... on all of this stuff?
Yeah, he said if no one's saying it, it's probably true.
Or if you're not allowed to say it, it's probably true.
Yeah, if you're not allowed to say it. Yeah.
But it was
well, you
really...
would think based on the mob that formed, and it's already kind of blown over, and that's the way this kind of cancel culture starts. But for that sort of that white hot, really intense day or two, you would think that like Chamath had practiced genocide himself. Because everybody comes out, and the way that they make themselves feel better is by virtue signaling on this issue. And again, I would just say that I think we should be thinking about what do we do? How do we actually make a difference? Because I don't think just virtue signaling on the issue is going to do it. At the same time that this mob was forming against Chamath, we had a 2-hour Biden press conference in which Biden never mentioned the Uyghurs once. The press corps never mentioned the Uyghurs once. So does that mean the Uyghurs are below their line? Why wasn't it mentioned? Shouldn't we be ganging up on Biden? Why is the press ganging up on Chamath when they're not ganging up on Biden for that? So there is a fair amount of hypocrisy here. I actually think, Jason, you make an excellent point that by discussing these issues and raising these issues, it creates a little bit of a check on the people perpetrating these atrocities because they don't like to be exposed that way. And, maybe we should be boycotting the Beijing Olympics. Maybe that should be on the table. Maybe we should be boycotting the NBA. Let's have that conversation.
Yeah. Or maybe everybody who goes there, I wouldn't want to see the athletes miss the Olympics, but maybe they could each just raise their hand and do a U or some sort of a signal to show they support the situation or they're aware of it with the Uyghurs. There could be some, modest protest or statement they could make without ruining, their lives' work. I always hate when the Olympics get canceled for some political reason because I think those people work so hard for it. But raising awareness, is a noble goal in all of this, and then also doing things is a noble goal. Yeah, I mean, it was very weird to watch the mob form and then dissipate, and just who was taking the time to actually listen to the full episodes. It was clear from that Atlantic article and some of the nuanced takes that they listened to the full discussion, because there are bullet points here like there was somebody asked me a very challenging question. I think it might have been you, Freeberg. Like, are we going to start invading countries over human rights? And then there's more suffering and death and pain from the wars. And when do you decide, as the democracies of the world, to invade the dictatorships of the world to promote human rights? Like, this is a very difficult issue that the world has had to deal with, sadly, before. And there is no easy answer there.
Right. Well, you're right. And this is a point that I also tried to make on the last episode, like Freeberg did, which is I think it's actually great to have these ideals, and we should have moral clarity about what's happening. And I think what's happening is wrong. It's outrageous. It's an atrocity. But the question is what we do about it. And the reality is, even though it's important to speak out about human rights, these types of fulminations about human rights, when they become this sort of, when we get into this like frenzy, it's been the prelude and pretext for every misguided foreign intervention that we've had over the last 20 years. And the Iraq War, I mean, Saddam Hussein was suddenly Hitler. The goals of nation building in Afghanistan for 20 years, our invasion of Libya. Yes. We got rid of Gaddafi and we replaced it with chaos.
For years, we were talking about how evil the Taliban and their social system was, and then we just handed Afghanistan back to them a few weeks ago.
Exactly. So, and so these types of, when you whip people up over human rights, I mean, I agree with the sentiment and I agree with the moral clarity, but I also can't help but recognize that neocons and the military-industrial complex and the Washington blob have used this type of rhetoric for decades to corral us and stampede us into wars and foreign interventions that don't make any sense. And we all recognize after the whole project has gone wrong, like Afghanistan, we become suddenly more realistic about the whole thing. And suddenly, we're not talking about, the sort of the moral atrocities of the Taliban anymore. But the discipline is
they're still there.
They're still there. The discipline, though, is to be able to check ourselves before we get into these interventions. And I don't think we do a good job of that. We're whipping ourselves up into these mobs and we're in a frenzy.
And the raising awareness is something that has been lacking. Certain organizations, and I think it's very important that we don't take organizations that have engaged with a country, let's say China or Saudi Arabia. They may have engaged in good faith with the goal of, engagement is a positive for humanity in the world. Okay, if we engage with China and we are codependent on each other, that will lead to a better arc for human rights and for humanity and less wars because our economies are entangled and we do business together. Okay, this is a fine premise. What the dictators and despots want you to do is to fight each other and not look at the human rights atrocities. So it's easier for us to say, oh, the NBA, oh, Apple, oh, pick the company or corporate interest or organization that has engaged. But by raising awareness consistently, it gives other people the ability to talk about this. Some organizations weren't willing to even talk about this or say the name Uyghurs. And if we keep talking about the Uyghurs, the chances that situation improves, I think there is a chance it does improve.
But I do think this notion that the four of us can get together on a podcast and not get canceled because, we don't collect money from advertisers, and we started having these conversations amongst friends and we just put it on the internet. First of all, it's a great kind of reflection of what you can do in the United States with the freedom of speech that we have, and we can just put this on the internet and anyone can watch it around the world. I don't know how many people are watching it, but
mostly freedom of speech.
Mostly freedom of speech. But I do think that it's pretty valuable, and I do think that that's an important point for us is as much as Chamath got completely destroyed this week, I gotta say, other than COVID, I'm feeling pretty good. You feel better. You're pretty bummed for a day or two.
I mean, I think the COVID thing was scary because 4 of my 5 kids got it. So I was just like, oh my God.
That's terrible.
How's everyone doing, by the way?
I'll be very honest with you. So between both houses, mine and my ex-wife's, 4 of the 5 kids got it. Our nanny got it. Nat did not, and the youngest baby did not. There's a real difference between in my house how the boys experienced COVID and how the girls experienced COVID. Quite honestly, we've expressed certain symptoms, specifically a really bad sore throat and a cough, that the girls in our house did not. The girls had more intestinal issues. The boys roughly did not. So it all manifested kind of in odd ways. But oh my God, I mean, what a pain in the ass.
Well, to be going through that and then also like monitoring Twitter and inbound, your phone must have been blowing up.
I wasn't doing any of that. Okay, Jason, start the pod. Let's go.
All right. Well, okay, everybody. Welcome to the All In Podcast. With us, the Sultan of Science, who's got a new startup he launched. We'll hear about that later in the show. The Rain Man himself. And, dare I say, the dictator, Chamath. I was like, guys,
yeah, it's not like we didn't warn you.
We counted 63 episodes. We called him the dictator. This was bound to happen. Let's start the show, everybody.
I mean, you guys were like, after 20 years of friendship, it's like, I don't know, the list is like 9,000 items long.
I was like, yeah, if you're going to cancel him, we got a long list here.